Hello and welcome to Within the Frame. I'm Handan in Seoul. U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris delivered a historic nomination acceptance speech at the Democratic National Convention last week, officially opening up 70 days of heated race for the White House. Attention is now focused on who will take the lead with the momentum from the DNC and endorsement of Republican nominee Donald Trump by independent candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. Meanwhile, here in Korea, reports are pouring in about the potential impacts of a Harris or Trump presidency on the country's security and the economy. On today's Within the Frame, we look into the latest key developments in the U.S. presidential race and explore their potential implications for South Korea. For that, Dr. Peter K. Lee, research fellow at the Asan Institute for Policy Studies, is here with us via Skype. He's also a non-resident fellow at the U.S. Studies Center at University of Sydney. It's so great to have you with us.
Thanks for having me on.
And joining us from Washington, D.C. is VOA correspondent Jessica Stone. Always a pleasure to have you with us.
Great to be with you.
All right, Jessica, let's start off with you. First, let's do a replay of the Democratic National Convention. Give us your overall assessment of the big event and the highlights, of course, of Harris's acceptance speech.
Well, the DNC convention was really about introducing Kamala Harris to Americans who don't know her outside of the vice presidency, of establishing her biography, of her personality, of what has led her to this moment. And so some of the highlights included the remarks of her husband and the repeated phrase, a joyful warrior. In terms of her convention speech, she also used that to introduce herself to Americans who may not know her well. She talked about her upbringing and her childhood in California, the daughter of an Indian American mother and a Jamaican-born father, and the observations she had about race and class and the things that are important to her as a politician. She talked about she talked about her work as a prosecutor, as Attorney General of the state of California, and now as Vice President. And she made an appeal to Republicans who denied that Trump lost the 2020 election to Biden, really trying to get additional votes to cross the aisle to her. That includes independents and Republicans who are disenfranchised with the way Trump reacted to his election loss. And she told them that she'd be a president for all of them, which is something we also heard from Barack Obama years ago, a real effort to reach across the aisle. She also waded a little bit into foreign policy. We haven't seen her talk a lot about her own views on foreign policy. She did say that she's going to, as president, if elected, defend U.S. alliances as well as abortion access. But other than that, political analysts really say that she didn't have a lot of policy in her speech. And for that matter, they also say Trump hasn't had a lot of policy in his speeches. He, for his part, meaning Donald Trump, criticizing Kamala's speech for complaining too much about the national conditions despite being in office herself for the last 3.5 years. But all in all, we see a real bump in terms of fundraising for the Harris-Walz campaign. $500 million raised just before her speech, and at last count, $540 million raised towards her campaign, and her campaign chair saying much of it is coming from new donors and from younger donors, both of whom are constituencies that this campaign is looking for.
So the DNC led to a massive fundraising for the Democratic Party. You said $540 million. That's a lot. And Harris saw a polling boost, according to many reports, and we'll talk about that later on. But before that, Dr. Lee, the next major event is undoubtedly the first presidential TV debate between Harris and Trump, set for September 10th. What would be some central issues of debate, and what key aspects should South Korea pay attention to?
Sure, Dan. I think just picking up on what Jessica was mentioning there, if the DNC National Convention was a chance for Vice President Harris to introduce herself to the American public and to the world, I think this next first debate with former President Trump is going to be a way to test her values, her principles, her policy agenda. So as Jessica was mentioning, we don't really know a great deal about what Harris thinks personally about the legacy with President Biden over the last 3.5 years. And so I think really it's going to be a challenge to find out, how much of what has been achieved is part of her legacy that she wants to continue and what she wants to forge on her own. So I think from a Korean perspective, at least, it's going to be how both candidates in this debate talk about the role of alliances, but also the great challenges that they face, right? So this idea of the axis of authoritarian regimes, China, Russia, but also North Korea and Iran. And so really what role the United States sees allies playing in terms of that great contest. I think from a Korean perspective, more specifically, it's going to be the role of extended nuclear deterrence and really the role that the Biden administration has played in empowering US allies to take greater steps for their own security. So we see things like AUKUS, the Washington Declaration with South Korea. Really, these are pretty unprecedented steps that the Biden administration took. So we're curious to see how both candidates want to go forward in that area.
The TV debate will certainly be another historic pivot point in the U.S. presidential race, and it'll be quite interesting to watch how Trump will take on Harris, who's now enjoying surging momentum. Now, Jessica, independent presidential candidate Robert Kennedy Jr. has suspended his campaign, throwing his support behind Trump. Is the endorsement emerging as a key factor likely to significantly impact the race?
Well, I think the key to your question there is significantly, right? And we just don't have all of the data yet in terms of the polling on what this could mean to the Trump campaign. But as you mentioned, over the weekend, we saw Robert F. Kennedy Jr. Basically leaving his own campaign under the impression that his own polling was telling him that he was going to be taking votes from Trump and giving them to Harris if he stayed in the race. So he got out, he endorsed Trump, and initially polls were showing that he would pull votes away from Biden, and then later on, as I said, going really that his candidacy was going to hurt Trump more than Democrats. So he pulled out, looked for that endorsement, possibly looking for a position in a Trump administration. Political observers, in terms of the impact, though, really looking at the impact not just on the national race of him pulling out, but on critical swing states in particular. A Cook Political Report survey showing that voters that found that of those voters in swing states, finding that Kennedy was losing ground with some of them. So it's not really clear yet where they're going to land. And there are some political observers who say that his voters might not vote at all. They might be really not looking for the sort of choice between these two candidates of Trump and Harris, or Trump and Biden part two. Others, though, looking to see for some kind of short-term bump for Trump. Again, the polling data not all in, and so we are looking for what that could mean for the Trump campaign. He certainly does have some common policy positions with Kennedy, especially when it comes to pulling out of global wars and rebuilding the middle class.
Because it's such a tight race, his endorsement could matter for both Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, especially in swing states, as you pointed out. But we don't know for sure how much of an impact it'll have. Now, Jessica, you mentioned that we need more polls, more poll results, more data to get a clearer picture. But give us an analysis of the latest polls and what other variables other than the TV debate are expected to shape the election landscape going forward.
So you mentioned it's a very close race, and that's very evident in the polls. We are seeing by Nate Silver, who's one of the leading influential political observers in the United States, a gap of about 4 points. Harris pulling ahead of Trump in a national average of polls at 4 points. Washington Post just saying a few hours ago that the spread is 2 points. So these are well within margins of error, and there's no question that both campaigns are looking at this as a very tight race. And that, of course, means that it's going to come down to where it comes down to, and we talk about this often, those swing states, those 8 or 9 states where the electorate is not in the tank for one party or another. A lot of them are in the Midwest. Some of them are in the Southeast, including Georgia. And that's where we're going to find both of these campaigns campaigning heavily, hitting these states hard. We're going to see Trump and Vance in Michigan this week. We're going to see Harris and Walz in Georgia. And again, these are the states where the voters and the way that they decide to vote in November are really going to determine the outcome. We know that so far Harris in particular is polling better than Trump. In the 18 to 34 demographic, Black and Hispanic voters, Trump leading with white and older voters. So it's also going to really come down to a turnout game. Can the get out to vote effort for both of these campaigns, can they get their voters to the polls? It's typically easier to get older voters to the polls than it is younger voters. And so that's going to be a factor in what the outcome is. Who is voting and who are they voting for? But that outcome, that turnout the vote, really key, especially for Harris.
So voter turnout is, of course, another very crucial point in elections. Now let's look into the foreign policy directions of Harris and Trump. Dr. Lee, you mentioned that we are yet to find out a lot more about Harris's foreign policy directions, but can you give us a rough outline of the two candidates' respective foreign policy approaches with a focus on their North Korea policy?
Sure. I mean, I think when it comes to North Korea, I mean, US foreign policy has really been at an impasse for the last 6 or 7 years, since about 2018, when President Trump last met Kim Jong-un in Hanoi. And so the US, on both sides has been in a holding pattern in terms of what to do with North Korea and the efforts at denuclearization. So I think in that sense, it's really a new opportunity come this November election to reset and to try new approaches. So we've seen that Vice President Harris has talked about how she will stand up to what she calls dictators, such as Kim Jong-un. Meanwhile, you had former President Trump mentioning that he got along well with Kim Jong-un and that he can handle these kinds of big issues and deal with strong men like North Korea. So I think you see the difference of approaches that they might take, but I think really it's important to keep in mind that North Korea is not the priority issue for either candidate at the moment in terms of foreign policy. So it's going to be, dealing with the war in Ukraine. It's going to be dealing with the war in Gaza. It's going to be dealing with China. And it's really the question of where North Korea fits into those larger puzzles. And I think, this idea of an axis of evil, an axis of authoritarian regimes that is increasingly talked about in America, North Korea's support for Russia, those will be the key variables that determine how the United States approaches the North Korean question. And it's really, I think, situation contingent. So much has changed in the last year or two in terms of North Korea's perceived threat to the United States. But I think, there's much more to be seeing in the coming weeks and months.
Right. It's undeniable that Washington has been placing North Korea in the back burner for quite some time now. And what will matter a lot more, the bigger question would be how they would deal with other countries like Russia and China in the region. Now, Dr. Lee, South Korea is also paying keen attention to the effects of America's so-called Polyconomy, how Harris and Trump's presidency would impact Korean companies and the overall economy. What are your biggest hopes and concerns?
So, I mean, the concern is that this is one area where there is great bipartisan consensus in America, it seems. This idea of an economic statecraft, the revival of American manufacturing, and America first in very different shades, whether it's, build back better, whether it's America first, jobs for American workers. So I think it's an area that, has become an easy target for, economically advanced allies such as South Korea, but also Japan, Russia, some of the Northern European countries. And so it's something where, there's been, growing bipartisan efforts, not only within the executive branch in the United States, but also within Congress. So both the House and the Senate have pushed, efforts to strengthen Buy American quotas and other areas of industrial policy. And that's really making a comeback right now. And I think that has effects not only economically, but also into the defense space as well, in terms of how the US is going to work with some of its, really important allies like Korea and Japan. I think for the hope for Korea is that, as Jessica was mentioning, some of those really key swing states, Korean firms have made, record investments into some of these areas, particularly in the Southeast, such as Georgia. And so, President Biden used to talk all about how he had attracted $100 billion of Korean corporate investment in the 3 years that he had been president. So in that sense, I think, the Korean companies have tried to demonstrate that they can deliver a win-win outcome with US workers, with US voters. And so I think there's an opportunity there to build on that success without it becoming a zero-sum equation, I think, from whoever wins the election.
Now to the Middle East, Jessica. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken has concluded his trip to the region without much progress in Gaza ceasefire talks. What do we know so far about Washington's plans for Gaza's future? And how does Harris's stance on the Israel-Hamas conflict compare to Trump's?
Well, I think we see increasingly that there's a constituency in the Democratic Party, and particularly in younger voters, that is very much shaped by this conflict. For example, at the convention, we saw about 270 delegates sign a petition asking the Democratic Party to take a different position on this conflict and make aid to Israel contingent on certain agreements regarding human rights. In her own convention speech, she did basically take the same position as Joe Biden has in terms of supporting Israel's right to defense. And what's more, the party continued their position, ignoring that petition that I mentioned before, and instead continuing the position that Israel has a right to self-defense, that a ceasefire in exchange for the hostages is a priority, and that they also back a two-state solution. The DNC did not add any language conditioning military support to Israel in any way. In terms of Donald Trump's approach, we largely have a promise that he's going to end wars in the Ukraine and Gaza without a lot of detail. And some of that is, sort of the idea that he says, well, these things wouldn't happen on my watch. Again, that's a claim that doesn't have a lot of explanation from his vantage point. Remember that he, on July 26th, did meet with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu in the United States, asking him, quote, to get the war over with. He says he will give Israel the support it needs to win the war in Gaza. He claims that Vice President Harris, by demanding a ceasefire, is tying Israel's hands. And he also says he will arrest and deport these pro-Palestinian supporters if he becomes president. So somewhat of a different approach between these two, but largely still taking the traditional U.S. position that the U.S. is a key ally of Israel's, while we see Harris certainly giving more attention to the plight of the Gazans, of those who have been displaced and killed, and who are now affected by the food shortages and the violence that's going on there, but yet still maintaining the position that the U.S. has had for quite some time with respect to Israel.
Dr. Lee, a group of top U.S. politicians from both ends of the political aisle are expected to visit Seoul early next month. What would be the purpose of their visit, and what sort of outcome do you anticipate?
So there have been reports that a Senate delegation will visit Korea as part of sort of trilateral talks with the US, Japan, and Korea in terms of economic security cooperation, going back to our discussion earlier. But I really think the purpose is sort of twofold. It's to shore up the two bilateral alliances in Northeast Asia that the US has, so with South Korea, but also with Japan, but also to keep that momentum going in terms of the US preference for trilateral and minilateral cooperation. So the Biden administration, but also the first Trump administration, has gone very hard in terms of minilateral cooperation. So we think about the Quad, AUKUS, and now Camp David partnership. These are areas where the US is very keen for its allies to work more closely together with each other as well as with the United States. So I think this delegation is really visiting Northeast Asia to show that the US will stay committed regardless of who becomes the president. And it's also because it's a Senate delegation with senators who are not up for re-election in this coming election. It's to show that there will be continuity, I think, in the US commitment, regardless of who wins the White House, but also the Congress on November 5.
And we'll conclude our discussions on that note. Well, the U.S. election holds significant implications for South Korea, affecting security, the economy, and much more. So we'll be watching closely as developments unfold. Thank you so much, Dr. Lee, for your presence with us today. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
And thank you, Jessica, as always, for your perspectives.
Great to see you.
And that brings us to the end of this show. Thank you for watching, and be sure to tune in same time tomorrow to join our conversation. Goodbye for now.